Excuse me, if everyone would please take their seats, the program will begin momentarily. Thank you. Excuse me, if everyone would please take their seats, we are ready to begin the program. Thank you.
Well, good morning. I'm John Hager, former Lieutenant Governor of the Commonwealth, and it's a real pleasure to be here with you today. I'm proud to serve as a member of the Virginia Advisory Committee of the USGLC, and on behalf of all the members of the committee, several of whom are here today, and our co-chairman, Senator Chuck Robb, and Senator John Warner, we really are excited about your being here. We welcome you and thank you for attending this luncheon here today. This afternoon, we look forward to a vigorous discussion about America's role in the world. The USGLC has assembled a distinguished group of leaders here in Virginia, both Democrat and Republican, who believe that America must be a global leader. Not only because it's the right thing to do, but it's also the smart thing to do. I'm sure you, like me, agree that what happens throughout the world impacts our security and our economic prosperity right here in Virginia. We understand that for the U.S. to be a world leader, we need to have a range of international tools at our fingertips: diplomacy, global development, trade, and aid. All these help to advance our interest around this world. I'm pleased to stand with the USGLC in its efforts to advance strong and effective international programs in order to build a better and a safer and a more prosperous world. I know that our special guest today, General James Mattis, Robert Zoellick, and Virginia's own Senator Tim Kaine join me in this pursuit. Senator Kaine, there he is. We particularly thank you for being here today with these leaders and for your dedication to these issues, and we look forward to your participation in this fascinating discussion. So now to introduce you to someone who knows a whole lot more about USGLC, the founding executive director from Washington. Please welcome Liz Schreier of the U.S. Global Leadership Coalition. Thank you, Liz.
Thank you, Governor Hager. You've been a remarkable friend.
Thank you.
Without your leadership, we would not be here today, so thank you. Well, welcome to everybody. It's a little cold out, but something about Richmond, Virginia makes it very warm and very welcoming, and I am thrilled to be here. And our featured guests today, Senator Kaine, Bob Zoellick, and General Mattis, we are all thrilled that you are here, and we are looking forward to hearing from each of you and sharing your wisdom to this conversation today. We would not be here without our partners that are making today possible. I want to thank the Virginia Manufacturers Association, Reserve Officer Association, Robbins School of Business of the University of Richmond, the Richmond World Affairs Council, and my dear friend Ann Goddard, who is the President and CEO of Child Fund International, a fabulous organization who is celebrating their 75th anniversary this year. So thank you to all of you. We have, along with Senator Kaine and his staff, we have representatives from Majority Leader Cantor's office and Congressman Ridgell's office, and we welcome you. And I'm thrilled that many of our Virginia Advisory Council members are here with us today. In the pamphlet on your table is a list of almost 100 members statewide of our advisory council that have joined us in our pursuit that I'll speak about in a minute. And as Governor Hager said, I would be remiss to not give a shout out to our honorary co-chairs, two of Virginia's great statesmen, former Senators Chuck Robb and John Warner, who, although they couldn't be here today, have lent their name and their credibility and their support to our cause, and I am very grateful to them. Now, some of you know us, and some of you are new to us. Washington, unfortunately, is a place that often divides, and we are very proud that we are a place that unites. The Washington Post called us a few years ago the Strange Bedfellow Coalition. And we got the name because, as you can see from some of these logos up on the screen, we actually bring together a very unusual group. Everything from 400 NGOs and businesses, from CARE to Caterpillar, from Boeing to Bread for the World, very unique organizations and a diverse voice. We have a bipartisan advisory council. It's kind of the who's who of foreign policy led by General Colin Powell. It includes every living former Secretary of State from Henry Kissinger to Hillary Clinton. It includes Mr. Robert Zoellick. We also have an unusual group for a group that advocates for non-military tools, which is a group of 150 former retired 3- and 4-star generals and admirals, including General Mattis, many and others that are here today. Pete Osmond, I know, is here somewhere. There he is, General Osmond. As well as 30,000 individuals who call themselves Veterans for Smart Power. Many of also are here today. And what brings us together is a belief in the importance of America's global leadership. There's a lot of ways that we show Americans leadership. And the one that we advocate for among them is a small but a smart investment in what we call the international affairs budget. It's about 1% of the federal budget. Some people call it the foreign aid budget. But it's a very important part of the budget that keeps us safe, advances our economic interests, and really speaks to our values in terms of our moral values. The best way I can explain it is to think about how so many of us are focused on what's going to happen next week in the world, in Sochi, Russia, as we all turn to the Olympics. It brings back a lot of my own studies when I studied Cold War politics, and we used to argue in my classes about whether we should use more hard power or whether we should use more soft power. It is so outdated, and I think we can think about that as we watch the headline news this week. And what we've really embraced is this idea of smart power, the idea to use a whole range of tools of global development, diplomacy, alongside defense. And our coalition has really worked to give voice to the development and diplomacy side of that equation. Now, I know that you in Virginia understand this well. In Virginia, you understand we live in a very interconnected, interdependent world. You understand that infectious diseases to terrorism does not have any borders anymore. I noticed when I was looking at Virginia that you understand this because you exported over 2 million tons of goods just last year. Now, when I think about an example of really what's happening around this country, we started a campaign last year called Innovations in Smart Power. And the idea was to find companies and nonprofits around the country that are innovating to find innovative solutions to global problems around the world. And there's one right here that let me just use an example of what's happening in Virginia. Where is Chip? Chip Ransler, who, if I have the story correct, you are exactly one of these innovators. There's a problem. A third of the population of India doesn't have access to electricity. Chip, when you were a graduate student at UVA, you were aware of this problem. You knew that there wasn't a lot of electricity, but there was a lot of rice in India, and realized that you could partner with some engineers in India and figured out that rice, with the husks that often are discarded, if you figured out the engineering, could figure out to create clean electricity. And with that engineering, was able to bring electricity to some villages in India and bring electricity to them. But with that project, brought electricity to a few villages. But there's a lot of people in India. But fortunately, Chip met Judith Pryor from OPIC, one of the senior execs from OPIC, which is a U.S. agency, part of this little 1%. They got a loan, a very small loan actually, from OPIC. But it's a loan that comes back to U.S. taxpayer dollar. Today, India, because of Chip, 200,000 citizens have electricity. That's smart business. Innovations like that are happening all over this country. And what we're doing is trying to show a spotlight on those innovations that are making real differences for people around the world. And many of those innovations are actually bringing jobs back home here in the United States. So what we want to do today is to have this very conversation about how we can do well and do good at the same time, about how we can make the world a better place and bring jobs back home and make it more secure for us. So the whole conversation we want to have with you today is how and what is the role of America in the world, and does it matter to us here in Virginia? We believe that the stakes are much too high for America to withdraw from the world. We think it's the right thing to do. I hope you hear from Senator Kaine about his missionary work in Honduras and why we need to care about people all around the world. I think we're going to hear why it's the smart thing to do from Bob Zellick, who will tell you about the economic implications, or from General Mattis about the security implications. So I thank you. I thank you for being part of the conversation today. But I think more important, I thank you for being part of our journey for tomorrow. Our mission really says it all behind me. Our mission of this organization, which we hope you'll be part of, is to build a better, a safer, and I'll add a more prosperous world. And for that, I encourage you to be part of our work today and going forward. Just before we start lunch, I want to invite Rabbi David Asher to join us and to say a few words, and then we'll begin the lunch. Rabbi Asher, thank you.
May the Almighty God on high bless us from his sanctified abode and provide us with the wisdom necessary to navigate through murky waters. May he who grants salvation to all peoples give us the strength to persevere and lead these noble efforts of fostering goodwill and diplomacy through charitable enterprises that are characterized by a rightful dignity. May he who has given life to the song of nature allow us to work in symphony and in unity to bring about a better tomorrow where those affecting and affected succeed together in bringing about the change we need for that all-important elusive peace that we all yearn for. O God in heaven, grant us the fortitude we desire so that we can serve you and your creations, so that we all might be able to achieve the potential you've instilled within us. Please grant us the patience and humility to guide our initiatives in a way that does honor to the name of God. O God in heaven, humanity needs your mercy, so let us look to you to provide us with the solutions to our most perplexing queries. May the doubts, the whys, and the reservations be driven from our minds so that we can better service our community. May pettiness and idleness fall not into our routine. Please, God Almighty, look after our promising future that we so desperately work for. Let our devotion to this coalition's vision remain pure and untainted. And ultimately, we pray for a collective resolve in order to bring up another loving generation that seeks out your values and your principles and internalizes the truth that is you. To quote Jeremiah Hanavi, "V'dirshu es shalom ha'ir, asher higlesi eskam shama, v'yispalalu va'ada el Adonai, ki v'shlomai hiya lachem shalom." And seek the peace of the city in exile, and pray for it unto God. For through its peace shall you have peace. And let us say, Amen. Everybody is welcome to begin their lunch. The program will resume shortly.
prep for us, right?
Always well organized.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Brett Vassy. I'm the president and CEO of the Virginia Manufacturers Association, and I am pleased to serve as one of the partners for this afternoon's event. Before we move through the remarks here and get on with our program, I also want to take just a moment and thank Liz and Carl and the USGLCA staff for making such a terrific event. They don't get recognized often enough, and they do great work behind the scenes, so thank you very much. And while we're saluting, we want to make sure at USGLC that we don't forget the men and women that have sacrificed for us so that we have these freedoms we're talking about with diplomacy and development. If you're a veteran in the room, would you please rise? We'd like to recognize you. So this afternoon, I'm standing alongside my colleague from the Virginia Advisory Committee, Ann Goddard, with the Child Fund International organization. You're probably asking yourself, what does manufacturing and a children's charity organization have in common? The reality is we both realize that America's leadership, global leadership, benefits us both. When you take a look at Virginia manufacturing in particular, we focus on the competitiveness of manufacturing domestically and how that affects the world abroad. We also realize that it is impossible for us to be able to be competitive in a global market without the development and diplomacy programs that we're talking about. If you take a look specifically right here in Virginia, we export over $18.1 billion in goods and services to foreign markets per year. In particular, in manufacturing, 84% of the Commonwealth's total exports are manufactured goods. That's a remarkable development that has just continued to grow over the years. In addition, 21% of Virginia's jobs are supported by international trade. Agricultural exports contribute over $907 million annually to our economy. And then, of course, that's why in Virginia, organizations like ours come together and support and champion the international affairs programs. But don't take it from me, take it from some insightful experts, which you'll hear from now.
With our economy the way it is today, some people are asking why we're spending so much money overseas
and not on creating jobs right here at home.
Well, actually, we're not spending much money. Just 1% of our national budget goes to the international affairs budget. That's not a lot.
And helping create American jobs is just what that money's doing.
If you want to create jobs, you have to create more demand for products and services.
You need more customers.
And where are American companies finding more customers?
Not here, but here. And here.
And here.
95% of the world's customers live outside the U.S.
95%!
When we sell goods to them, they're called exports. U.S. exports accounted for a big part of our economic growth last year.
Half went to developing countries.
And their economies are growing 3 times faster than developed countries. And every 10% increase in exports equals a 7% increase in jobs here.
So, how do we increase exports?
Build new markets for American goods and services.
Remember that 1%?
America's international affairs budget helps fund programs
That improve health and education.
supports agriculture development,
Builds a stable economy.
And creates new markets. So if we don't go to the biggest, fastest growing group of consumers,
other countries will. Other countries already are.
Investing a small amount in global development and diplomacy
it's not only the right thing to do,
it's also the smart thing to do.
To make our economy stronger.
to create more jobs.
For my mom.
For my dad.
Or my neighbor.
For me.
Now, of course, I have to say that children are the experts. That was a great video. My name is Ann Lynham Goddard. I'm president and CEO of Child Fund International and a member of the U.S. Board of Directors of the USGLCA. of the U.S. Global Leadership Coalition. Liz, how could I have mixed that up? Child Fund is a partner in today's event and a proud member of the USGLC. At Child Fund, we work to help deprived, excluded, and vulnerable children living in poverty have the capacity to become young adults, parents, and leaders who bring lasting and positive change to their communities. And just this year, as Liz has mentioned, we're celebrating 75 years. I'm proud to say we were born in Richmond 75 years ago to help children in China. My, how the world has changed. And this has been our home for the last 75 years. Whether it's fighting hunger, malaria, or HIV and AIDS, empowering women and girls, advocating for justice, or rebuilding communities after disaster like in the Philippines now, we are eyewitnesses to the life-changing impact of that small but mighty 1% of federal spending that we know as America's international affairs budget. Today's program promises to deliver a timely and thoughtful discussion with leaders who understand the core values of America's global leadership. I am honored to introduce General James Mattis, a man who requires little introduction, but whose list of accomplishments is far too impressive to go unrecognized. General James Mattis is an experienced leader who dedicated over 4 decades to serving his country in uniform. He is also a member of USGLC's National Security Advisory Council, which now number, as Liz has mentioned, 150 retired 3- and 4-star generals and flag officers. Also joining us is Robert Zoellick, former president of the World Bank and friend of the USGLC. During his tenure, he prioritized investments in global health, education, food security, and empowering women and girls, recognizing that they create important sources for economic growth. Prior to his service at the World Bank, he served in numerous high-level posts during the administration of President George W. Bush, including as U.S. Trade Representative. And finally, Senator Tim Kaine, another man who needs very little introduction, particularly here in Richmond. Today's conversation about America's global leadership and its impact on Virginia is one that could not take place without the Senator. As a member of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, and given his career-long dedication to the state of Virginia, Senator Kaine has a unique perspective on the role that smart power plays for our national security and economic development. We are so honored to have all of these distinguished experts with us, and we look forward to hearing their insights. Moderating our discussion today is Emmy Award-winning Christian Broadcasting Network political correspondent David Brody. Please join me in welcoming our panel.
This should be fun.
I think we can. We have name tags, yes?
Indeed. Take it easy on us.
Well, welcome, everybody. It is great to be here. This is like, I'm going to call you the big three, like the Miami Heat. LeBron James, I don't know where LeBron James is exactly. LeBron James, Dwayne Wade, and Chris Bosh, to use an NBA analogy. We have the big three right here. So once again, a big round of applause, please, for this distinguished panel. We are going to have about a 50-minute discussion, 35 minutes up here, another 15 minutes of your questions. If you are following us on the internet, on Twitter, this is being streamed live, you can go to #SmartPower and you can submit questions. You can also submit questions right there at your table. There are some note cards there for you, and then there will be some folks from USGLC coming around to collect those, and we'll ask the panelists. All right, well, let's start with you, General. Let me ask you a question real quick. You had said something, it was interesting, and I want to read you the line that you said. I feel like this is Mike Wallace in 60 Minutes. No, it's not Mike Wallace in 60 Minutes. But you have been in some difficult spots around the world, obviously. Iraq, Afghanistan, we can go on and on. You said this one time when you were at a Senate hearing, and you said, quote, "If you don't fund the State Department fully, then I need to buy more ammunition." And I'm wondering what you mean by that exactly, and maybe how that sheds some light on international development.
Yeah. David, my point that day was we're engaged in an international competition of ideas, competition of values. And we're going to have to engage in traditional diplomacy. We're going to have to engage in some sort of communications that compellingly, that persuasively conveys our values. Now, they grew out of the Enlightenment. They got voice in our Declaration, our Constitution, our Federalist Papers. But right now, there's a competition going on. There are people who thought, maniacs who thought by attacking us on 9/11, they could scare us into silence, scare us into retreating from the world. Well, we've proven we don't scare. But the bottom line is that's not good enough just to prove we don't scare. Now we have to engage, and that means traditional diplomacy. That means education programs that bring students to our land. That means the counterparts to Radio Free Europe and Voice of America going into places where hatred's being espoused. We've got to engage, and that was my point that day.
And the fallout, if that does not happen, if there's not full engagement financially from the State Department, the funding, what happens then at that point?
Well, the challenge we face right now, ladies and gentlemen, is there's only two elements of our government that are truly, in the executive branch, truly composed for competition. One is the CIA, and the other is the military. We need foreign policy, foreign aid, the State Department, everyone organized for competition in this free competition of ideas. I'm convinced that ours have stood the test of time over hundreds of years. And I'm convinced there are millions of people, hundreds of millions, who will respond to those ideas. But absent that response in a positive way, vacuums, at least in the area I was working with, the Middle East, are not generally filled by good people. We've got to stay engaged. If we create a vacuum in this area, then we should not be surprised with what comes out at just that time of history when there's some pretty recalcitrant people out there in terms of power over people. And we don't look at it that way, but we're going to have to engage.
Very interesting. Senator Kaine, let me ask you, there were a lot of committees that you could have been on in Washington, D.C., but the Senate Foreign Relations Committee was a very important one for you because international development, I know, is very important to you. Explain exactly why international development and being on that committee are so integral into your worldview and what you can do on that committee to affect change.
Yeah, David, thanks for the question. I feel really blessed in the Senate to be on three committees: Budget, Armed Services, and Foreign Relations. And they are just, they tax me to my last nerve ending. I really wanted to be on Foreign Relations because I felt like it would round the experience of being on Armed Services. Armed Services is so critical to Virginia, as we all know. But American power really, I view the sort of current age of American power as having started with Teddy Roosevelt. We were somewhat blessed by having oceans on both sides, and we could be a little bit isolationist in the first 100+ years of our country. But Teddy Roosevelt, when he was president, not only sailed the Great White Fleet around the world that he had helped develop as Secretary of the Navy, but he brokered the end of the Russo-Japanese War and won a Nobel Peace Prize in 1905 for doing that. And that began sort of a new era of what it was to be a powerful country. Economic power. By that point, we were the largest economy in the world. Military power. But there also has to be diplomatic power and power of the economy. And we do our best work in the world when we balance those four spheres of power. And if we lean too hard on one and let the others atrophy, then we're not the nation that we should be. So I really wanted to be on foreign relations to try to balance that, balance my work on armed services. And the last thing I'll say is this: for Virginia, the mission of the Global Leadership Council is great for everybody, great for every American. Virginia has more connection and more to gain in this global world and global economy than anyone. Most governors would love to have an international airport with 400 nonstop flights a week to foreign cities. Most don't, but Virginia does. Most governors would love to have the second most active port on the east coast of the United States. Most governors don't, but Virginia does. And remember, the Virginia company that came to Jamestown Island in 1607, they were venture capitalists, right? They were not, it was not primarily a map-making expedition or even about religious freedom. That was an expedition that was fundamentally about global economic opportunity. So from our origins to our current and especially to our future, the role of global development, trade, aid, diplomacy, moral example, these things fit together in an integrated way in Virginia as much as they do in any other state.
Very interesting. Chairman Zellick, let me ask you about the relationship between economics and security. You have once, we always have these quotes here, you once called the new foreign policy, international economic strategy. You called it the new foreign policy. What do you mean exactly by that?
Well, first, let me just take an opportunity to thank Liz and her team, which really do a tremendous job. And for all of you Virginians coming to take time, it's pretty heartening for those of us involved in international affairs on a cold day to do this. I just have to say a word about Senator Kane because he was a little too humble on this part. I serve on the Rolls-Royce International Advisory Board, and that board is coming to meet in Virginia this June. And when Senator Kane was Governor Kane, he's the one that brought Rolls-Royce to Virginia. And if you go look at their operation, you see what it means in terms of economics and power and influence because you see all the logistics and supply networks and jobs it's created to it. Mm-hmm. And so to come back to your question, it's in some ways, I think it's pretty fundamental that, you know, the economic drivers of national power, whether it's resources, assets, people, technology, innovation, and then as a matter of economic policy, those are America's interests, whether it's trade, investment, jobs, and frankly, influence around the world. Most people, you know, the U.S. military is an incredible representation of what American power stands for. But I just came back from Singapore over the weekend, and I'll tell you, our economic influence is what matters to a lot of people in East Asia. And the other piece, which you saw a little bit in your video, is the values. You know, the nice thing about the belief in our American economic system is that, you know, markets are also about economic liberty. They're about a private sector. They're about freedom. It's all connected to civil society and others. So that's all what's wrapped into it. And just to give you two little examples, General Petraeus and I, who is the general's forerunner at CENTCOM, are co-chairing a task force looking at North American integration. Because we believe that there can be a lot built with our continental base. Mm-hmm. And just think about this. You know, people talk about 1.3 billion Chinese. But if you have 500 million people in North America, 3 democracies, what now may be self-sufficient energy, even with exports, integrated infrastructure, complementary manufacturing and services industries, if we invest in the human capital, and you're even starting to see the Mexicans move closer to Canada and the U.S. on security issues. And so all of a sudden, with that combination, 1.3 billion Chinese looks a little different. But that won't just happen on its own. It has to be part of a policy. Or as General Mattis, his experience has shown, you know, for Afghanistan to succeed, or the countries in the Middle East and North Africa, or Haiti, it's not going to work unless they have some economic foundation. It just won't work if people don't have jobs and opportunity and hope, rule of law, governance systems. So again, I've worked on both the security and the economic side, but I think the challenge is how you integrate those two together. Mm-hmm. And frankly, the last thing is, you know, for the United States, we got our own challenges with some of the debt issues. You know, if we're going to be able to continue to play the role in the next century that we played in the last century, we have to clean up some of these challenges at home. So sometimes people talk about economics as sort of a come home America. I think that would be dead wrong. It's a question of how you strengthen the country at home so we can also be influential abroad. And I've also seen if we're influential abroad, it also helps people at home.
Interesting. You know, you mentioned integration, and General Mattis, I'm wondering about the integration between the military and civilian leaders, because how do you go about doing that in danger zones, if you will, in tough spots around the world? I mean, we're very territorial as people. We like our stuff and we like our areas, and we don't want people, especially in Washington, D.C., to infringe on that area. How do you get folks to work together in these areas?
Well, the first point is to recognize that the main driver of us overseas is not the military, as sound as the military is. It's our economic relations and it's our foreign policy. That's under our ambassadors. So the first thing you do in the military to integrate is you identify what is the foreign policy of the United States, and you stay firmly inside the left and right lateral limits of that. And it's not that difficult. For example, the Middle East, for all of our energy independence, which is coming, there are going to continue to be 3 anchors that keep us in the Middle East. One of them is oil. The price at the pump will continue to be set where 40% of the world's oil comes out of, the Middle East right now. That's a reality. So you can't say because we're going to have energy independence, we don't have to have an integrated foreign policy, security policy, economic policy, because it's reality. This is a market driver. Second, of course, we need our friends in this world. And the State Department is the lead on making friends and keeping friends. No country can make it without your allies, and we need to tend to those friends and allies. And a third point, of course, is we live in an age of violent jihadism. And we're going to have to work with countries overseas and integrate what we're doing with what they're doing in order to deny the enemy the opportunities they're trying to take advantage of, for example, at the Olympics this year. So it all has to be tied together. It's tied together with the State Department in the lead, and the military can give significant advantage to the State Department. I'll give you an example. 2 years ago, you were all hearing how Iran, or various Iranian leaders were talking about putting mines in the water of the Straits of Hormuz. How much have you heard about that in the last 6 months? I'd suggest very little. And what we did 2 years ago, we put together an operation, a training exercise that was an international mine clearing exercise. Now, the free flow of oil has got to be maintained for the global economy. So we didn't make an anti-Iranian exercise, we made an anti-mine exercise. I thought we'd get a dozen countries. Thanks to John Harvey's Fifth Fleet, they were able to put together, the American Navy put together there a mine clearing exercise that instead of a dozen countries, the first time we did it had 29 countries, including Djibouti, Canada, Estonia, Singapore, Japan. These are not bellicose nations. And the Iranians looked at it and realized they were actually creating an international coalition against them that was brought forward by the only Navy in the world that could have done it, the U.S. Navy. And it silenced them and bought time, I think, for our diplomats to try to solve this problem because some hotheads in Tehran were cautioned that you don't want to bring the international community against you. It shows how the military can help stabilize and drive down the risk of fighting to buy time, but that's all it does is buy time for economic and policy efforts to integrate and find a way forward without another catastrophic war in the Middle East. I hope that gives you an example.
No, it does, and the buying time is a crucial aspect to all of that. Senator Kaine, I'm curious about this. Your faith is very important to you. The humanitarian aspect of this and the faith aspect of this really do go hand in hand, and you've kind of seen this up close. And you know what I'm going to mention, Honduras, because early in your career, I know you traveled there. And how did that shape your view of what we're discussing today as it relates to international development? Tell folks about that a little bit.
So many in the room, because I'm with friends, people were thanking me from coming, and I said, don't thank me, I live a mile from here. I mean, these guys had to travel a long way, not me. But the pivotal experience in my life next to parent and husband was a year that I took away from law school to work with Jesuit missionaries in Honduras. I was 22. I was a first-year student at Harvard Law School. Everyone around me seemed very sure about what they wanted to do with their lives. I learned later they were just better actors than me. They were no more sure than I was. But I decided to take a year off to kind of figure it out. And I knew from my high school in Kansas City some Jesuit missionaries in Honduras, and I wrote them and said, let me come work with you. I'll just be a volunteer. And they said, fine, come. I didn't know what I would be doing until I landed. They put me in charge of a school that taught kids to be welders and carpenters. My dad was an iron worker, and so I knew that side of the technical field, and then spent that academic year with these youngsters. This was in 1980 and 81. It was a very challenging time in Central America. There were civil wars going on across the borders in both El Salvador and Guatemala. Honduras was a military dictatorship. The Contra War in Nicaragua was heating up. It was a very tumultuous time, but it was also a time of just incredible learning for me deepened my faith life, certainly. There's not a day that goes by that I don't think of some lesson about people, the poorest of the poor that I worked with, and the great adversity that they showed in dealing with life's challenges. But it also taught me about so many other things. You know, you take for granted the things that you take for granted. I didn't know anything different than the society I lived in. When I lived outside of this society, you know, living in a military dictatorship where no one can vote for anyone teaches you something about the importance of small d democracy and how passionate people are about wanting to pick their own leaders. So the institutions that we take for granted. And then also the similarities between people. You know, when Jefferson wrote the great words that all men are created equal, he just didn't say all Americans. You know, it was people, wherever and whoever. We are all created equal by God. And you came to understand something about the similarities. And so since I returned from Honduras, you know, I came back a very changed person. And I would suspect that anybody in the room who has lived abroad, wherever you've lived, or traveled abroad significantly, you've had that same experience of certainly learning about others, but probably more learning about yourself and about your own condition. And I also came back with the great, you know, sort of accidental gift of now speaking a language that 40 million Americans speak in their own home every day. And that has been spoken here, actually. The English came to Jamestown in 1607, but the Spanish came to St. Augustine, Florida in 1565. So Spanish has actually been spoken continuously longer in our territory than English has. And the ability to interact with 40 million Americans who still speak Spanish as their daily language at home has also been a powerful connector that reminds us, you know, in just exactly the way as Bob and General Mattis have talked about, the connections are important, and we have to maintain them across a variety of different spheres.
Chairman Zellick, you mentioned Asia before, and of course the administration has been bringing up this Trans-Pacific partnership. Where does all of this fit in as it relates to the trade balance in the Asian region, if you will, and what it means for the United States, for folks here in Virginia, and maybe kind of explain it, dumb it down a little bit for everybody so we understand.
Well, this is a trade negotiation, but it's more than that. That's why it's called a partnership. It's investment, a whole series of rules, which the U.S. is having with 11 other countries. And of those 11, 6 are already free trade partners of the United States, so it's really adding 5. And of that set, the idea is to try to integrate them as an economic unit. And fundamentally, U.S. free trade agreements are somewhat different than other countries. They're very comprehensive. So they've got manufacturing, they've got services, they've got intellectual property, investment, they have environmental labor provisions. So they're more demanding than other agreements. But because of that, in a way, what they often do is take other people's economies and align their rules closer to the U.S. rules. And the benefits you can see are from some of these past agreements. It turns out in the first 5 years of a free trade agreement the United States negotiates, our exports to that country are about 3 to 4 times the rate of our exports to other countries. So you see the boost. In terms of the 20 free trade partners that we have around the world, they represent about 45% of our exports, even though they only represent 10% of the world economy. So you can see we do better there. And also, interestingly, while the United States runs a deficit worldwide, with our free trade partners, we're overall in surplus. I'm going down this week to Chile, which is a free trade agreement country that I negotiated with. It's the 10th anniversary. And I think our exports have been up about 700 or 800%. So you see this big boost. And again, it's a right combination. So in some ways, as you put these together, you can see why it's in America's interest to try to engage these overall, but it's always a politically challenging vote. So what happened now is that the Congress is starting to put forward an authority called Trade Promotion Authority. And this is because under our Constitution, the right to negotiate trade rests with the Congress. But if you're going to do a deal with a country, you can't obviously ask them to make sort of their tough steps and then sort of have it all unravel. So what the Trade Promotion Authority does is allows people to vote it up or down, yes or no. And it allows Congress to engage in the process by setting the goals and sort of creating the procedures. But this will be a challenge, as Senator Kane knows, because this one is kind of an interesting one. Republicans tend to be more supportive of trade, but this is a Democratic president who's seeking this for the Trade Promotion Authority for the Pacific and Atlantic and other agreements. So this is an issue that I think actually will engage people this year to try to see whether we can keep the momentum. And you and others made a key point, which is that I travel a lot, and if the U.S. doesn't stay in the game, others will. You know, and these, particularly a lot of these developing countries are very much sort of growth markets. And in a way, the simplest way to remember it is our barriers are already about down here. Most countries' barriers are here. So you go to free trade, we go a little bit down, and they go a way bit down. And it's kind of a no-brainer if you really think about it.
General, there are a lot of hot spots, obviously, around the world, and there's a lot of controversy as to whether or not we should get involved in certain places or when we should limit our involvement or continue our involvement, whether it be Syria, South Sudan, Iraq, Afghanistan, go on and on. How does the United States get the most out of this in their best interest in these countries? How do they go about it? How do we succeed as a country in these tough spots? And is that to be the goal to begin with anyhow?
Well, I think it can become the goal at some point, but if you take what the senator and the chairman have been saying, first of all, it's the old adage of what do you do if you have a ship along a rocky coast with an onshore wind? Well, first of all, don't get in that position. You know, you don't do that. We're here to talk about smart power, not dumb power, so let's not get there. But I think what you have to look at is falling back on a former chairman of the Joint Chiefs, General Colin Powell's doctrine, his 8 points about before you get involved in a security manner with someone where you commit our troops, certainly help them protect themselves, the rule of law, law enforcement, military, by all means. But before you commit our troops, make certain it's a vital national interest that you can sell to the American people. I wasn't in the Marine Corps for 40 years. I was in the United States Marine Corps. We're accountable to everyone in this room via your elected representatives. That's the way it goes. If we cannot make a persuasive argument to you, the American people, that this is a vital interest for our values, for our economic well-being, then you've got to reconsider being the world sheriff every time. Sometimes you just have to recognize the world's not going to comport itself to our view of what it should do, and recognize we have no moral obligation to do the impossible. We shouldn't be apologetic about our values. We should do everything we can with economic policy and diplomatic policy to shape that world, information, education programs. But I think we have to be a little careful about considering ourselves the world sheriff and spending the American taxpayers' money and spending the American people's sons and daughters on things that perhaps are ill-advised in terms of our vital interests. Not everything is vital. So I would start there and make certain you have a strategy. What is the political ends you want? What are the ways and means to accomplish it? President Jim Wright, President Emeritus of Dartmouth University, wrote an article last summer in The Atlantic that talked about what did we learn from the Korean War. And the first thing is, if you don't have clearly articulated political end states from the immediacy, from the first time you go into a commitment of troops, then you're probably going to have a problem ending the war. And witness Korea, Vietnam, Iraq, now Afghanistan. This has got to be clearly stated. And right now, ladies and gentlemen, we need more people engaged in this country and driving toward a strategy that, for example, we had one in the anti-communist days, one of containment. We all knew, Republican and Democrat, we knew where we stood on this thing. I'm not sure that we replaced in these complex times that strategy with a new strategic component. So that's the way I would approach it.
Interesting. Now, Senator Kaine, a lot of folks like to beat up on the international affairs budget. You know, in other words, there's a lot of misconceptions out there, and Liz talked about that earlier, just 1% of the budget. Do you run up against those misconceptions, and how, this idea that, there's a lot of money that actually isn't going to international affairs that should be. So how do you kind of beat that perception? What do you do exactly?
Well, David, you do run into the misconception. People think the budget's a lot bigger than it is. So, Liz, kudos to you for the video, because I think it lays it out very well. It's 1% of the budget. Now, I'm an old budget guy, from being a mayor and governor. Even in the 1%, you can always figure out ways to do better with the 1% and do more efficiencies and measurables and deliverables. But we first have to start and disabuse people of the notion that it is a huge chunk of the budget. It's small. Secondly, we do have to share with people, what that 1% contains. So even if you get down to 1%, well, the number sounds big, but it's people have the idea that 1% is just, we're just stroking a check to folks, across the waters, and that's also wrong. So much of what we do in that foreign aid budget is of massive value to the U.S. economy. So when we fund an OPIC, Overseas Private Investment Corporation, or Ex-Im Bank, and we're helping American customers, big companies, small startup companies, find global markets, we're creating jobs right here. When we have a farm aid program to help hungry people around the world, we're buying a lot of food from American farmers, and if we weren't, they would be worse off. So a lot of that 1% actually, it's not even indirect feel-good benefits back to Americans and American jobs. It is directly connected to American economic activity. And then you add the value, as has been described, of, if we're not engaged, others will be. I had a really interesting conversation on the Foreign Relations Committee with the President of Chile recently. And the nice thing about I'm on this committee with Senator Menendez. If the other senators drift away, then Senator Menendez will tell any Latin head of state, we can talk Spanish now, and they dispatch with the translators. And they're a lot more candid when they're not talking through translators, is what I've found. And we started to talk about this issue of engagement, and frankly, the president was saying, we are so culturally close to the United States that in terms of who we want to do business with, we want to do business with the United States every day. And if it's a choice between the U.S. and China in terms of who we want to do business with, it's not even close. But China is engaged now, and the U.S. isn't so engaged. And this is with a nation where we have that 10-year history of a free trade agreement. And so that budget is such a good bang for the buck if we use it right. And so we need to explain to citizens and to our colleagues that the amount is not exorbitant, that the amount includes direct economic impact right here at home in terms of jobs. And then if we leverage it the right way, the sky's the limit in terms of the value of that investment. The ROI on this investment is very high.
Mm-hmm. You mentioned the United States and China and that relationship. There is am I on? Yeah, I think I'm on a little bit here. There is a question from someone in the audience to you, Chairman Zellick. Here's the question. Does not China's effort to build economies in the third world far exceed what the U.S. does? And I'm wondering if you can maybe talk about that relationship in more broad terms.
It's mixed. China is one of the tremendous growth stories over the past 30 years. It grew at about 10% a year for 30 years. Even so, what you see going on in China now is they realize they're going to have to change their growth models, so they're going to have to make structural reforms just as Europe and the United States and others have. Mm-hmm. But just take the case of Chile, what Senator Kane mentioned. Chile is now China's its biggest export partner. U.S. is second. But Chile primarily sells commodities, a lot of copper, to China. United States, it's a more value-added sort of production. The United States is still the biggest foreign direct investor in China, in part because of the rules, or in Chile, because of the rules of these agreements. I think it's inevitable that as China grows and it buys more things, frankly, if you look at American soybean prices, and it'll soon be corn and others, the China market is what's made a much better life for American farmers, is that they'll play more of a role. Now, the question really comes home often on kind of the developmental aspect, like in Africa, where they're after sort of resources. And here, the story is inevitably mixed. Frankly, when I was with the U.S. government or with the World Bank, I think it's a mistake to try to say to Africans, oh, you shouldn't have the Chinese, because they'll say, well, who are you to tell us, with American and European experience. But frankly, we can also help them. So whether it comes time to contracts, whether it comes time to sort of getting the Chinese to develop the resources in a way that are more environmentally sound, that involve more African workers. And I'll tell you the reality, if they don't, they'll get into their own problems. And so just as I listened to this panel, one of the reasons why America has to stay engaged with all these regions is the way the clock keeps coming back. Senator Kane talked about Korea and Teddy Roosevelt, and it made me smile because if you read the newspapers today, you'll see the sensitivity between Japan and Korea. And frankly, this dates back exactly to those events in sort of 1905 and 1906, the things that Teddy Roosevelt negotiated, this peace agreement. So people in the rest of the world have long memories, sometimes too long. One of the benefits of the United States is it's a country that's always looking ahead. It isn't handicapped by the past. But we're now in a new age with China. It's a question of how we can work with China effectively, but also deal with some of the security considerations that will develop as they become more militarily powerful. But I think in other regions of the world, the challenge will be for the United States not to say, stay away, because that won't work, but to work with the other countries to make it more effective.
All right. Let me ask this question. Actually, there's a question from the audience here to the general, and I'm curious to get your take too, Senator. Here's the question. How will the reduction of the military in Iraq and Afghanistan, that type of, in that situation, affect U.S. foreign policy, but also diplomacy and development? So how does that reduction of military, how will that play out?
Well, it is inevitable, ladies and gentlemen, that we are going into a more heavily naval strategy in terms of our support for foreign policy. And considering that Virginia has got the largest naval base in the world, it's also got the only NATO headquarters on American soil. It's a reminder of both the naval aspect, but also that we're going to have to work more closely with allies in the future, because the nature of the world's economies and the rise of the rest means that we have got to work with others in order to carry this load. It should not be carried solely by the American taxpayer. So I think what you're going to see is a shift to a more expeditionary kind of effort. Certainly we can defend America. We may have to adjust the strategy, the political ends. There may come a time when, as much as it is anathema to us to stand aside when some horrible things are happening, if we don't maintain the cost of a very large and capable military, we may have to swallow our pride on something. That's inevitable also. But at the same time, if we keep our allies strong, if we tend to our friends, if we keep our values foremost, if we say there are certain things that we simply not only stand for but will not tolerate, I think there's a way, using kind of centered around the U.S. Navy as our arm of decision, and then you add the Expeditionary Army and Air Force and, of course, the Marines who ride on the Navy ships, there's a way for us to engage in a positive way without breaking America in the process. And I think that's what's going to be the longer-term impact.
What do you think, Senator?
We have some immediate work to do to communicate to our allies in the Middle East that we're not going away from the region. Because they look at the withdrawal from Iraq and Afghanistan, they look at, oh, America's energy independent now. We're getting close to it. Maybe they don't need us as much. And I have been recently, and General Mattis and I were talking about this at lunch, in some settings where they've really been sort of banging on us about you're moving away from the region. I frankly wish that the administration had not talked about a pivot or rebalancing to Asia, because there's an incredible need for our focus on Asia, but as soon as you say that, anybody who's not in Asia says, oh, I guess we're not as important anymore. So the language even created some challenges. But I was in the Middle East recently at a security dialogue with a lot of our Gulf state allies, and I said, let me challenge you on we're leaving. Our trade is up. Foreign direct investment is up. We're more diplomatically engaged in tough negotiations, whether it's in Iran, in and around Syria, Israel, Palestine. We're more diplomatically engaged in the Middle East than we've been for a long time. We put military force through NATO into Libya, and we cast a vote, and we're willing to do military force in Syria to punish Bashar al-Assad's use of chemical weapons when other nations weren't. We're not leaving. And we were even willing to keep a U.S. presence, a larger presence in Iraq, but they did not want that. And the Iraqi foreign minister told me, he said, in a public meeting in Bahrain, said, President Karzai should not make the mistake that we made in Iraq. When the U.S. was willing to stay and we didn't want you to, President Karzai should not make this mistake. So I think the general did a good job of saying, here's kind of the things we need to do. But I do think we have to communicate to our allies because they have some natural concerns. Even this energy independence thing, for us, it's fantastic. But it creates a significant anxiety among those who have always known that we would be there if nothing else than to keep sea lanes open for oil exports. We're still going to do that, but we have to make sure that our allies understand that.
I am curious. Oh, go ahead, please.
I just started to add, first off, I thought we have got one broad-minded Marine general here when he talks about the Navy first and the Expeditionary Army. I say, this shows the benefit of those joint commands and central command. I want to draw out this Afghanistan point in this because it actually shows the connection with economic security very well. Let me give you two examples. One, when I was at the World Bank, one of the things I did to actually kind of prod some thinking on this in the U.S. government was I was looking at the numbers of the Afghan army that was supposed to be built. And then I was looking at the numbers of the Afghan economy and trying to have some sense of what the revenues would be. And I actually, because the World Bank had a big operation in Afghanistan, and I was trying to say to people, you know, if you think about the size of the economy and it can only support so much in the way of revenues for its army, and you're building an army of this, you got a little delta here in terms of who's going to pay for the remainder. So you have to be honest as a country. Are you either going to pay those billions of dollars a year to supply the army, or you're going to have a smaller army because if otherwise you build it up and all of a sudden you take it down. That's a very practical example about how economies matter for stability and military in a country where we've been fighting for 10 years. But the other side of it is we'd started a program, this predated me, in Afghanistan called the Solidarity Program. And what it basically amounted to was very small grants, $30,000, $40,000, that would go to a small community. But they would decide where the money went. So we forced them to put together councils, sometimes men and women, sometimes men and women separately. But they decided, would it be for micro-hydro, would it be for roads, would it be for a school? The economic rate of return of these projects was over 20%, which would be a pretty good return for anybody. But the other thing is when the Taliban would go after some of the schools, for example, the people would fight them off because these were their projects. So it's an example of how if you're going to sustain in very difficult places, the local people have to own it. So if you're doing something of a foreign assistance or a security side, part of our strategy is how do you connect those two so that the local people are partners and ultimately own it themselves.
The chairman mentioned foreign assistance. I want to get back to you real quick on the Syria issue. You brought up Syria. This refugee crisis, just horrific over there. What should the United States do in a situation like Syria when it comes to the humanitarian aspect of all of this? This has to do with foreign assistance and money here.
Syria has got to be one of the most challenging issues that we have dealt with globally for a very long time. I was with General Austin recently. He said he thinks this is the toughest one that he's seen in 30 plus years in the Army. I was speaking with the ambassador from the UAE recently, and he said the same thing. Very, very tough. And it may be one of these examples that atrocities are happening that just call out for a human response from all of us, and yet what is the U.S.'s role to deal with those? I felt like it was an important role that the U.S. should play, that if you use chemical weapons in violation of an international norm that's been in place since 1925 against civilians, there's got to be a response or you're just going to have more of them used. And so for that reason, I was willing to vote for the use of military force to punish and deter future use. However, the deal that is destroying that chemical weapon stockpile is a very good substitute. We wouldn't have accomplished that. That wouldn't have happened without a threat to use military force, because Syria and Russia were stonewalling every effort to deal with this until they were faced with the threat of military force. And so that shows how these things fit, diplomacy and military. But the one area where we might be able to forge a consensus in Syria, even amidst a lot of questions about who exactly is the opposition, is on the delivery of humanitarian aid. First to the refugees in other countries. So the U.S. is the largest provider of humanitarian aid to Turkey, to Jordan, to Lebanon, to the nations that are dealing with this mass of refugees. But then the internal humanitarian problems and the internal refugee movement within Syria, we should be able to work with a coalition of nations to be very, very aggressive about the delivery of humanitarian aid to Syrians on whatever side of the civil war they are. And I think we should find a way with partners to be aggressive about humanitarian aid delivery and frankly dare Assad or dare the jihadists in the opposition to get in the way of a global community's effort to deliver humanitarian aid. If we can put together a coalition for the aggressive delivery of humanitarian aid inside Syria, and I think we can, I don't think either the Assad regime or the jihadists within the opposition would dare to mess around with us. But so the humanitarian piece may be the one piece where it would be somewhat easier to find common cause, but it's a thorny problem.
All right, I think we're getting towards the end, so it's now time for kind of the lightning round, if you would, a game show. So good luck trying to get these in 30 seconds to a minute or so. Here's a question from the audience for you, General. What is the best way to measure foreign assistance to ensure we're getting adequate return on our investment? It's a great question, and it's something I know a lot of Americans are very concerned about.
David, it's a very good question, and trying to get my own hands around it, I tried to quantify what we were doing in various countries that I was responsible for the military operations surrounding that area. And then I wanted to see how could we measure the effect. How often do they vote with us in the United Nations? How often do they support us militarily? What kind of free trade agreement or economic agreements do we have? There's got to be a way that we holistically evaluate those countries, and frankly, we should not be afraid to take our own side in a fight, in an argument. And reward, an organization gets the behavior it rewards. We need to reward those who seem to be aligning with what we think is the right way to go without becoming dictatorial and losing our friends in the process, because not in all areas do they agree with us. That would be the way I would approach it.
What do you think, Chairman, from an economic standpoint? What's the best way to kind of get that return on the investment that economic experts always talk about anyhow?
Well, it's very similar to what the General said, and the key is to focus on results and be quite rigorous in focusing on results. People often focus on inputs, how much you're spending, what you're doing, but whatever your measure is, children going to school, girls going to school, sort of health operations, and it's important for people to know that some of this has made a huge difference in HIV/AIDS and malaria, and you've had a tremendous sort of health effect. I think you have to combine that with a real openness and transparency about what you're doing. And one of the things I always tried to talk to people at the World Bank about, you also need to have an analytical rigor, because look, if poverty were so easy to eliminate, somebody would have done it a long time ago. But it's natural that a lot of the people who work on this run into the problem of what I call, it should have worked, I wish it worked, I really wanted it to work, but you have to be honest to know when it didn't work so that you can try to learn and from our mistakes and try to fix things and improve things. And the last point on this is just, what's quite striking is this is no longer just a U.S. burden. What you've seen with the rise of developing countries, there have been a lot of lessons, a lot of learning about what works. And frankly, what we've seen, this goes right back to our basic story about openness and trade. The countries that are more open, that have moved towards rule of law, the open investment, they do better.
Well, and that kind of raises this whole idea, and you've heard the skeptics saying, look, we, the United States, can't be the world's policeman, that at some point we need to pull back, whether it be economically, militarily, or otherwise. So what do you say to those skeptics who say, look, the United States needs to pull back, and what might be the repercussions if we did from a foreign assistance and diplomacy standpoint?
So, I agree with that we can't be the world's policeman. I think if somebody comes up to me and says that, I say, I agree. But what we need to be an exemplary nation. Sometimes we talk about whether we're the indispensable nation. Indispensable can often mean we think we got to be in the middle of everything, even when we don't. But I want to be an exemplary nation, and if we're an exemplary nation, then we will be indispensable. Let's focus on being an exemplary nation. While we cannot be the world's policeman everywhere on our own, we can build coalitions. I think the General said we've been looking for a foreign policy doctrine since the end of the Truman Doctrine, right? So the Truman Doctrine, we're going to contain the Soviet Union. Everywhere they put up an X, we're going to put up an O, and vice versa. And that was from President Truman to the collapse of the Soviet Union. That was America's foreign policy. It affected the creation of the Peace Corps, our military budget, foreign aid budget, everything. Since the collapse of the Soviet Union, we haven't had an organizing principle. It was ad hoc for about a decade. Then it was war on terror. But war on terror is too narrow a strategy for a nation as great as ours. It's a defensive kind of bunker kind of strategy. Fighting jihadism and terror has got to be a piece of it. But that can't be our foreign policy. Our foreign policy's got to be bigger than that. And I think as we're looking for that next iteration after the Truman Doctrine, it's probably going to be heavily multilateral. We'll defend ourselves unilaterally without asking anybody's permission. But if we're going to promote values, we have to find partners. And if we can't find partners, we have to look ourselves in the mirror and ask, is the value really at stake? Are we looking at the situation right? So defend ourselves unilaterally, but promote our values multilaterally. I think that's kind of that gets us by just being the world's policeman. We got to build partnerships.
And just a quick follow-up. What can folks in this room do to further advance that development diplomacy angle and to work with certain civic and faith and business organizations? What can folks in this room do to be proactive?
Now Liz just loves that question. I mean, I'm just, you've given her a softball.
She was the one that actually asked.
Become part of the Strange Bedfellows Coalition is the answer to that. Join any of these member organizations, whether it's the Child Fund or the GLC. 25 years ago, almost all the development money in the world was put in by governments. Today, about 80% of international development money is put in by companies and NGOs, and only about 20% by governments. International development has dramatically changed and become more NGO and private sector driven, with governments obviously playing a critical role. But whether you are a part of a coalition like this, or whether you find one of the members of this coalition that is exactly what you're focused on, you are doing patriotic work that's going to help people right here at home if you engage vigorously in American global leadership through one of these organizations.
What do you make, real quick, of this U.S.-Russia dynamic in terms of the relationship, or potentially lack thereof at times? What does it mean for United States cooperation around the world?
Ladies and gentlemen, we're going to have opportunities given to us by this enemy we're up against, because the enemy we're up against is up against any kind of integration. It's their way or the highway. And I think we were talking last night, Governor, over dinner, that when the Russians are attacked by terrorist bombs in Volgograd, the next day, the director of FBI and CIA, of Scotland Yard, of Interpol ought to be in Moscow saying, we're going to help you hunt these guys down to the ends of the earth and dispatch them. We have got to see opportunities to work with non-traditional allies, people we haven't always been with, because the enemy's going to give us that opportunity, and we should not forego it when it happens. I think there's a way, following what the Senator talked about, in terms of promoting our interests, where we work more with allies in the future. We devote more attention to friends around the world. We need them, and we're going to have to do this and take our own side in this fight, even if at times there are places where we disagree with each other. It doesn't mean we have to stop all support for one another, because in some narrow sphere, we don't agree. We've got to get over it. That would be my initial response, Chairman.
Well, first, I was working with Secretary Baker and the first President Bush at the end of the Cold War. And as I reflect on a lot of the causes that came to the breakdown of the Soviet Union, one that you have to keep coming back to was $15 a barrel oil. Gorbachev, my own belief in the view of the Soviet economy, if you hadn't had that situation, I'm not sure they would have tried perestroika and realized they had to reach out. And I just mention that because today, with the economic reforms in Russia, it's still basically an energy play. And in that sense, the economy is got a fragility to it, because you tell me about the price of oil, and I'll tell you about some of their situation going forward. The demographics of Russia, it's a dying country. I mean, you look in the eastern part, and because of alcoholism, men are dying in early age. So in a sense, what you have with President Putin is somebody who's, in a sense, trying to reestablish his old view of Russia and the empire. It's not going to work. So I think, going back to the point that the General and the Senator both made, we also need to work with partners on this. So the Russian pressure on Ukraine and Georgia and others, frankly, is something that should not be acceptable to us, but we're not going to go be sending in the U.S. Marine Corps. The question is, can we and the Europeans and others help support the people in Ukraine that want to stand up to the Russian pressure? Ultimately, it's got to be sort of their choice. So I think, again, whether it's at a time to be alert to the fact that some of the Russians themselves are recognizing that they're going to have to undertake sort of economic reforms to change it. Over time, Russia could be a partner with some of the other dangers in the room. But in the meantime, we may need to reset the reset.
Can you just give me your quick view on that, 30 seconds or so on U.S.-Russia relationships politically?
Both of these guys know much more about this than me. But what I will say is, we learned something about Russia, obviously, when they changed their calculation on Syria. They changed their calculation about Syrian chemical weapons as soon as we were willing to use military force. And I don't think they did that because they love Bashar al-Assad. I think they could care less about Bashar al-Assad. They have other interests there. But one of the interests they have is one that General Mattis mentioned, is they have the same fear about non-state terrorism, whether it's Al-Qaeda or Chechen separate. They have interests about terrorism that match us. And so we need to find that ability to work together on those issues of common cause. And then the second thing, and this is more in General Mattis's expertise, but we're going to have to rethink a little bit some of these international institutions like NATO. NATO was established as part of a Truman Doctrine to check the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union really was an enemy. We have tensions with Russia, but they're not really the enemy of the United States the way the Soviet Union was perceived to be. So these issues of like NATO expansion, well, it was one thing to do that when the Soviet Union was an enemy. Russia still views NATO expansion as, wait, do you think we're your enemy? We're not your enemy. We don't agree on everything. So some of the institutions that were created in a Truman Doctrine world, now that there is no more Soviet Union, conceptualizing their next chapter going forward is a very important thing for us to do to try to maximize the chance of working together on those issues where we do have common cause.
Very nice. A wonderful discussion. Thank you all both very,
so
very
much.
much. A big hand, please. Wonderful. That was great. Thank you so much. Thank you. That was great. Thank you very much. Just stay seated. We'll have some brief remarks.
Hi, everybody. My name is Carl Beckstein. I'm the USGLC's Virginia Outreach Manager. And first off, I would just like to thank our speakers here today, Robert Zellick, General Mattis, and Senator Tim Kaine and David Brody. We really appreciate you being here with us today. I'd also like to thank a few close friends, Brett Vassy, Ann Goddard, and Lieutenant Governor John Hager for being here with us, as well as our co-hosts today, Child Fund International, the Virginia Manufacturers Coalition, the Robbins School of Business at the University of Richmond, the University of Richmond, the Richmond World Affairs Council, and the Reserve Officers Association. We appreciate all the hard work. I've also have Colonel Joe Waddle and Colonel Bill Parrish who have really helped make this event a great success. But quickly, I'd like to reflect on some words that Liz Schreier, our executive director, likes to say about the difference between a good meeting and a great meeting. What happens at a great meeting is not what happens during it, but what happens after. So I ask all of you to join us in supporting strong development and diplomacy alongside defense. In the next few days, I'll be emailing all of you with some highlights from today's event and the important discussions we had. So I ask you to please share what we talked about today at this event with your friends and your colleagues that couldn't be here, to like us on Facebook and to follow us on Twitter. But I think most importantly, what we need is to ask you, the true leaders in the Richmond community, to tell us who wasn't here, who we need to be engaging and talking to the next time we're here. So please send me your thoughts and ideas on what we need to do next and who we need to talk to. And finally, we are very happy to announce that our annual conference will be coming up this year on June 17th and 18th in Washington, D.C. And we'd like to invite all of you to attend. We have a great group of people that will be there. It will be a great opportunity to meet different members of Congress and key leaders from the military, foreign policy, business, and humanitarian communities from all across this country. So with that, I look forward to working with all of you. And on behalf of the USGLC, thank you for coming.
Right, well, I'm reminded that the Army Expeditionary Force in 1970